Amid the ancient sands of the Middle East, new flames are igniting, revealing a backdrop far more complicated than what we know. The surprising rise of Hamas and China's shadow. In a startling 6-hour span, Hamas unleashed a barrage of rockets, firing 5,000 projectiles. The ensuing 48 hours saw over 2,000 Hamas fighters flood into Israel, targeting at least 11 Israeli military bases and approximately 20 cities. Such a large-scale military initiative could not have been hastily prepared. Beneath the 365 square kilometers of the Gaza Strip, under the dual blockade by Israel and Egypt, smuggling tunnels snake their way into the Egyptian border. These tunnels, some large enough for vehicles and others just for crawling, serve as lifelines for Gaza's inhabitants. Under the cover of these channels, the underground rocket manufacturing factories of Hamas operate discreetly. Ordinary metal pipes are transformed into rocket casings, while common chemical substances are converted into propellants. The secrets behind this rocketry can be traced back to the highest military commander of Hamas, Mohammed Deif. According to some social media investigative reports, he studied at the Military Engineering Academy in Shijiazhuang, China, where he acquired his rocketry expertise. This hints at China's undeniable involvement in the Middle Eastern landscape. It is rumored that Deif's talent for munitions production led to his selection by the Palestine Liberation Organization for advanced artillery training at China's Shijiazhuang Military Engineering Institute in 1996. 2 years later, he married a woman believed to be from the Dongxiang ethnic group in Gansu province. Their wedding, held in Dongxiang, drew officials from China's United Front Work Department. Notably, there are many linguistic similarities between the Dongxiang language and Palestinian Arabic. An Israeli airstrike in 2014 tragically claimed the lives of 2 of Deif's sons and a niece, also severely injuring his wife, who decided to return to China in 2015 for a prosthetic limb. China's deep involvement in weapons technology and its considerable support for Hamas underline Beijing as a pivotal player in this conflict. In a shocking revelation by overseas Chinese social media platforms, it is alleged that Deif's Dongxiang wife secretly returned to Gaza in 2019, establishing direct communication with President Xi Jinping's office, further exposing China's strategic interventions. Hamas's tactics were not conceived overnight. Over the past 2 decades, their efforts against Israel have faced repeated setbacks. This historical context means Hamas knows that only by striking at Israel's vulnerabilities can they achieve significant victory. And now, given the shifting international circumstances, Hamas seems to be seeking such an opportunity. Israel's strategy before the attack seemingly played into Hamas's hands. The majority of Israeli forces were redeployed to the West Bank to safeguard settlers, leaving Gaza's defenses relatively thin. This was particularly pronounced on October 7, the holy day of Simchat Torah, when young IDF soldiers were yet to awaken in the early hours, leaving defenses lax. This presented Hamas with an ideal window of opportunity. A new turn in the theater of war. After 72 brutal hours, Israel finally quelled the Al-Aqsa flood operation on October 10. However, disagreements arose between Israel and the United States on how to proceed with Gaza. America, in its bid to maintain Middle Eastern strategies and ensure Saudi allegiance against tilting toward China, advocated for Israeli restraint. In contrast, Prime Minister Netanyahu had a more aggressive plan in mind. Under U.S. pressure, on October 7, the Israeli cabinet meeting concluded that the primary objective was to weaken the combat capabilities of Hamas and Palestine without mentioning Gaza's occupation. Yet merely 2 days later, Netanyahu hinted to President Biden about possible ground operations. In response, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken held discussions with Netanyahu on October 12. Prior to this, on October 10, China was already discreetly exerting its influence in the Middle East conflict. Chinese envoys swiftly engaged with Egypt, proposing emergency food assistance for Gaza. Using this as leverage, the envoy closely communicated with American military allies in the Middle East, suggesting that as long as civilians stayed in Gaza, they would neither starve nor lack water. They encouraged these nations against supporting Israel's evacuation plans. When the Palestinian Liberation Organization got wind of Egypt's food assistance proposal, they vehemently opposed any evacuations from Gaza. In a surprising turn, after discussions with the Chinese envoy on October 12, Israel expressed deep disappointment in China for not condemning Hamas's offenses. This statement underlined Israeli concerns. It appears that China has successfully convinced other Middle Eastern nations to stand against the Palestinian evacuations from Gaza, essentially pressuring Israel and the United States towards escalating the conflict. Under China's alleged covert maneuvering in the Middle East, on October 12, the U.S. bolstered its support for Israel. Blinken and Netanyahu issued a stern joint statement warning Middle Eastern nations not to intervene should Israel decide to attack Gaza. The subsequent U.S. military actions reaffirmed their resolve. On October 14th, the U.S. Secretary of Defense arrived in Israel, announcing the deployment of the USS Eisenhower from Virginia, expected in the Middle East within 13 days. Although the U.S. had previously considered not deploying troops in Israel, they have now decided to deploy a rapid response force of 2,000 personnel near Israel. Notably, the USS Ford was already in Israeli waters since October 7th. However, despite these robust measures, the U.S. still urged Israel for restraint. Wary of a large-scale ground war, their concerns were likely amplified due to the safety of American hostages in the region, especially given that 11 American hostages had already met with unfortunate fates. Following U.S. Secretary of State Blinken's departure from Israel, he promptly visited Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, nations regarded as staunch allies of the U.S. in the Middle East. The significant number of American troops stationed in these countries is striking. For instance, the Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE is home to 3,700 U.S. troops, while the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, recognized as the primary base for U.S. forces in the Middle East, houses as many as 10,000 troops. The close-knit relationship between the U.S. and countries such as Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, and Qatar are notable. These nations have openly declared that even if Israel were to launch an offensive attack against Gaza, they would not retaliate against Israel. Meanwhile, it's evident that the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, has shifted its strategic focus in the Middle East towards Syria. Although relations between Israel and Iran remain icy, Iran's relations with the West seem relatively warmer. Neither the U.S. nor Iran desires a war in the Middle East. If the CCP wishes to escalate conflicts in the region, they would primarily rely on Syria. Presently, Syria has launched rockets toward Israel, and Lebanon has commenced firing, revealing its stance. Some analysts believe that the apparent puppet master behind these tensions is China. On October 7th, the Russian deputy foreign minister made an urgent visit to China, suggesting Russia's desire to understand China's latest intentions in the region. Deep into the night of the 14th, while the deadline for Israel's 24-hour evacuation order for Gaza had passed, the expected ground offensive did not unfold. Israel's official statement mentions recent torrential rains as the hindrance for their advancement. However, upon closer inspection, it appears that Israel is discreetly laying a siege on Gaza to weaken Hamas's combat capabilities. Crucially, Israel is closely monitoring the movements of the two major U.S. aircraft carrier battle groups. Once both carriers are in place, they will exert an unmatched military pressure capable of countering any retaliation from Shiite groups. The combined deterrence of two carriers indeed surpasses that of a single one. Azerbaijan's exclave. Amidst monitoring U.S. military movements, Israel is closely observing the escalating tensions between Azerbaijan and Armenia. On October 13th, Secretary of State Blinken revealed that Azerbaijan might launch an offensive against Armenia in the upcoming weeks. Israel ties with Azerbaijan are profound, extending beyond just providing military equipment. They also maintain a small military presence there. With strong bilateral relations, Israel also stands as a principal buyer of Azerbaijani oil. Azerbaijan possesses an exclave near the Turkish border. However, this territory is separated from the main part of Azerbaijan by an area known as the Zangezur Corridor, which is Armenian territory. Azerbaijan's ambition is to control this corridor to connect with its exclave. Iran vehemently opposes such a move, fearing that if Azerbaijan links up with its exclave, it would form a contiguous territory with Turkey, thereby creating a Turkic influence in northern Iran and posing a threat. If a clash erupts between Azerbaijan and Armenia, it's likely that Iran might intervene. This involvement could weaken Iran's support for Lebanon and Syria, alleviating pressure on Israel. If Turkey joins the fray against Iran, its influence in the Middle East would wane. With Saudi Arabia, another significant power in the Middle East, having a lower likelihood of military intervention, the strategic situation would favor Israel. In such a scenario, Israel's operations in Gaza would proceed more smoothly. On October 13th, Blinken indicated that this situation might arise within the next few weeks, or at most within 4 weeks. Half a month after the arrival of the USS Eisenhower aircraft carrier, Azerbaijan might launch its attack on Armenia. Forced to adjust its strategy, Iran would face the deterrence of the U.S. aircraft carrier, which would intimidate Syria and Lebanon, clearing Israel's path to invade Gaza. On October 15th, White House Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, in a bid to stabilize the Middle East situation, engaged in covert discussions with Iran, urging them to avoid escalating the conflict. Utilizing negotiation leverage with Iran, Sullivan managed to bypass Netanyahu and reached an agreement with Israeli authorities to resolve water supply issues in southern Gaza and the evacuation of Western personnel, facilitating a ceasefire that lasted 5 hours. October 16th, 20 minutes after these stabilizing efforts were announced, Netanyahu's office refuted them, asserting that Gaza hadn't observed the ceasefire and no humanitarian aid had been provided. Gaza's water authority also denied any water provision, putting Sullivan in an embarrassing situation. Against this tense backdrop, President Biden planned to visit the Middle East on October 18th, yet on the eve of his visit to Israel, the night of October 17th, the Baptist hospital in Gaza was attacked, leading to a tragic fire that claimed the lives of nearly 200 women and children. While it remains unclear who orchestrated the attack, its aftermath led to Palestine canceling their meeting with Biden in Jordan. Despite the setback, Biden didn't return empty-handed. He joined a wartime cabinet meeting in Israel alongside Blinken and Sullivan. During a subsequent press conference, Biden defended Israel by citing data from the U.S. Department of Defense, suggesting other potential reasons behind the hospital attack. Netanyahu commented that Hamas represents a different kind of enemy and that the Israel-Palestine conflict is a different type of war, insinuating that Hamas doesn't differentiate between civilians and soldiers, and hence neither does Israel in its strikes. This implies that the war might lead to even more casualties, hinting that the U.S. should brace for the repercussions, in a bid to counteract Chinese influence. Nonetheless, Netanyahu appeared to show a willingness to compromise. On October 18th, the Israeli military announced the establishment of a humanitarian zone near Khan Yunis in southern Gaza. Located on the southern coast of Gaza, not bordering Egypt, aid coming by sea must undergo checks by the British and American fleets, effectively countering potential Chinese influence and preventing Egyptian intervention. The move also aims to attract residents from the northern part of Gaza, especially after the attack on the Baptist hospital in Gaza. This decision was attributed to the efforts of Sullivan. According to UK media, Biden could only privately express support for an Israeli military incursion into Gaza. Analysts believe this stance mirrors strong domestic U.S. opposition against an Israeli offensive. Interestingly, since October 14th, when the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, announced the deployment of the USS Eisenhower aircraft carrier group into the Middle East, its progress appears deliberately delayed. The aircraft carrier lingered near the coast of Virginia for 4 days, hinting at a possible delay from certain U.S. factions reluctant to offer overt military support to Israel. This influence is substantial, able not only to seemingly stall a carrier, but also to mobilize a group of black-clad Jewish protesters to rally at the Capitol building. On October 18th, demonstrators from 2 Jewish groups urgently called on the U.S. to pressure Israel to cease its military actions in Gaza. This left Israel perturbed. Will the aircraft carrier ever arrive? On October 19th, Israeli media broadcast a message to the U.S. stating that they were ready for a ground assault on Gaza. Despite military actions typically being covert, openly discussing military preparedness evidently serves as a warning to the U.S. If there isn't swift action, Israel might proceed. Given the current scenario, it is expected that the U.S. military will soon announce the Eisenhower swift journey toward its destination. From another perspective, the U.S.'s current delay strategy might aim to control Israel's pace, while simultaneously securing time for its strategic deployments in other regions, such as in Azerbaijan and the Senkaku Islands of Japan. Currently, the USS Carl Vinson is crossing the Pacific en route to Japan. Recent diplomatic moves by the CCP have reignited concerns. Earlier in October, the Homs military academy in Syria suffered a terrorist attack, with no group claiming responsibility. However, on October 13th, the same day Israel announced the evacuation of Gaza residents, a reporter from Shenzhen TV mentioned possible connections of the attack to the East Turkestan movement, prompting speculation of CCP involvement. Considering the CCP might use the pretext of counterterrorism for its military ventures, this suggests a potential influx of weaponry, advanced satellites, and intelligence systems into the Middle East. Recent visits by Syrian leader Assad to China have fueled suspicions of the CCP's strategic positioning with Assad.